Gratitude is always a response, which is at the core of what worship really is. When we are asking for help, that's a response to our need. When we're giving thanks, that's a response to God's greatness. And one is me-oriented, one is God-oriented, right? And one is me-centered and one is God-centered. And one of them leads to joy. I think the other one leads to a sense of obligation and entitlement. Like, God, you're supposed to help me. Where are you? Why aren't you doing these things? And it's amazing how that perspective shift of gratitude and making that effort, being God-centered as a disciple that's following Christ. Here's an interesting thought is joy, which is wrapped in grace, which is wrapped in thanksgiving, and they're all intimately connected. And Jesus would regularly practice that. And it's just a thought of this New Testament idea that thanksgiving is feasting on the grace that God has given and finding my joy at the center of all of that.
Shelton, welcome back onto the show.
Well, thank you, man. I'm excited to be here. Excited to, it's been a while.
I know.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think what I said last time, but you didn't let me back on for a while. I didn't know what.
No, always always good to have you on. And we, like I said before, I think we always have great conversations. Sometimes
you've had some great guests. It's been fun to watch all of those, and this is an encouraging platform, and so I love getting to share it with friends and folks that are trying to follow Christ. So I'm excited to be back.
Well, today we're going to talk about gratitude, and we're not doing it just because this podcast is coming out a little before Thanksgiving, although maybe that plays some part in the timing. But, gratitude is something that, as we've focused on it with our church, Paseo del Rey, here in California over the past several weeks, it's really highlighted how this is a central foundational piece of being a person of faith. And so I want to start off just by talking about why it matters, why gratitude is worth not just discussing today, but cultivating as people of faith, followers of Jesus. So let me just throw you that question. Why does gratitude matter?
I think it's at the heart of living by faith and not by sight. It really is of not getting distracted away from the path of Christ. I think it's gratitude battles the enemy on so many fronts. I was thinking this morning on where sin entered into the world and the story of Satan deceiving Eve and how she had a garden full of trees she could feast on. And yet he was able to distract her away to think about the one that she was not supposed to touch. And I just was wondering how much would have gratitude for all that God had given her, protected her in that moment from the temptation for what he had not given her in that. And you can make an argument that even in that tree that he's withholding, there's a gift in why he's doing that, obviously. And yet she couldn't see that. And I think about my own life. I think about the number of lives that I've seen sin and temptation really wreck, and how many people have forsook great things in their life for something that they thought they didn't have and wanted, and how much they regretted that later. And just wondering, I think gratitude would have been a profound tool on their daily walk to say, man, God, you have blessed me with so much. Let me live out of the abundance of your grace. And we'll talk about that word later on, that grace and gratitude are intimately connected. Let me live out of the attitude of that and the posture of that. And then that would shield me in so much from the temptations of the evil one. What about you? What are reasons you would say for why it matters so much?
Well, you're touching on a theme that I hope we get to explore more, which is the connection between gratitude and perspective. Looking at Eve there, she's in paradise. She's in this perfect world. She does have access to all the trees aside from this one that God has prohibited. And how sin can come in as a result of failing to have that perspective, and how gratitude helps us have that perspective. I think if you fast forward to Paul writing his letter to the Romans, he starts off in chapter 1, and it's a very sobering passage because he talks about how sin has distorted humanity and broken the world. And we see this descent where God, 3 times it says that, because of sin and because of mankind's turning away from God, that God gave them over. So 3 times it says that because men were moving away from God, God gave them over, and things get worse and worse. But it struck me a year or 2 back as I was reflecting on that passage, it really starts with a failure to acknowledge God or to give thanks. That's what Paul says, is that even though they knew God, so it didn't start with unbelief or just a rejection of God outright. It started with a failure to acknowledge God and to give thanks. And because of that, we see this downward spiral. And of course, Paul is describing that on a worldwide level, a human history level. But I think it plays out in our own lives as well as individuals, that when we fail to acknowledge God and we fail to give thanks, we can really start down paths that lead to a lot of darkness and brokenness in our own lives and in our families. So I think gratitude matters because it's kind of like that first domino. If we can cultivate it and we can develop a spirit and a practice of gratefulness, like you said, I think it will protect us. When we fail to cultivate that, it can really be that first domino that leads to a lot of heartache.
I 100% agree. I'm sitting here looking at this Romans 1 text, and there's so much good. And I would even back up before that when it says that the qualities of God can be clearly seen in what he has made. And then the next verse says, but even though they knew God, they didn't glorify him or give him thanks. So then their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. And the word there meaning they could not see anymore, even though it could have been seen. So there's this, as you're talking about perspective, this ability to see God's hand in our life is so intimately connected with our giving thanks. And I just love that. Like, the God's incredible qualities are clear if we would but look and see it. And I think gratitude is the way that you look and see it. And so you go outside and see just the awesome nature, something as simple as watching a sunset and being in awe, or and feeling, waking up in the morning and being grateful for air in your lungs that you did not create or start, or any of those things. You begin to see God more and more. But to choose not to do that, as you're pointing out, is then to start down this road of futile thinking and a darkened heart, where we don't see God anymore, and we think it's about us and the world we create, and then enter in temptation and sin and the road of destruction. It's a sad thing that I think gratitude would be a battle up front. So I love that observation. I think you're exactly right.
We're touching on a principle of gratitude that I hope comes through in this conversation. It's a bit of a chicken or the egg thing, right? Where we would say, well, if enough was going well in my life, then I would be more grateful. But I guess what I would want to suggest for our listeners is maybe it's the other way around. If we could cultivate eyes to see all that God is already doing, then we would be more grateful.
Yeah, the track record would say that that's not true at all.
Yeah.
That sin, one of the ways that sin so deeply affects us is that we are so much more prone to see what we think is wrong and what we are lacking. Mm-hmm. That's what we lay down our head at night. That's what our natural bent, like a steering wheel in a car, that the alignment is just off.
Right.
So to know that my sinful nature is off and that I will see that. So that's why we will not see all the good things of God and just naturally see broken things or things we don't like. And so I think gratitude is the purposeful recorrecting of this broken nature with us. And which then therefore, he can continue to give you good things as he has been doing every day that we've been alive. And yet we're never satisfied in that because of our natural bent. But if we naturally correct that, I think we would be quoting, Psalm 23 and David saying, my cup overflows, Lord. Surely your goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Like, we would just be so grateful because we've seen it and we're choosing to see it over and over. So yeah, I do think it's a purposeful thing. I think it's a practice you have to cultivate and work towards.
And that's what I hope will come through here, is that this is something that can be cultivated. We don't have to wait until something changes externally, because God is already present. He's already at work. Really, what we need to do is learn how to cultivate and practice gratitude so that we develop those eyes to see. I wanted to start off with a story out of Luke 17. I'm going to read this because it fits with our theme today of being grateful. And this is a story from the life of Jesus where he heals 10 lepers. So let me just read it. We'll talk about it a little bit. And then I'd love for us to move into talking about how gratitude changes us, maybe get into the nuts and bolts of that and how it actually changes the world around us. And then maybe we can finish with some practical ways to begin cultivating gratitude. So this is Luke 17. We're going to read verses 11 through 19. It says, while he was traveling to Jerusalem, he passed between Samaria and Galilee, and Jesus entered a village. 10 men with leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and raised their voices, saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. When he saw them, he told them, go and show yourselves to the priests. And while they were going, they were cleansed. But one of them, seeing that he was healed, returned, and with a loud voice gave glory to God. He fell face down at his feet, thanking him, and he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus said, were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Didn't any return to give glory to God except this foreigner? And he told him, get up and go on your way. Your faith has saved you. Now, Luke is the only gospel author who records this particular story. I'm so glad that he did. This has always been a hard-hitting vignette story from the life of Christ where Jesus heals these lepers. But any initial thoughts from you as we read through the text there with Jesus and his encounter with these 10 lepers?
Yeah, it was just interesting that all 10 called out for healing, but only one came back to say thanks. And you just wonder, like, how selfish is my worship? How selfish is my praise, that my prayer, that I'm not really God-centered. I'm not really in awe of him. I just really want something from him. Like, that's the temptation. Like, I'm willing to call him master when I'm in need. But am I willing to fall at his feet when that need has already been met and I'm no longer in that deep place of need? I find that interesting and convicting down to my core of making the effort to come all the way back to fall at his feet to say thank you. You know, what about you? Any thoughts on there?
Well, I do have some thoughts on it, and this is actually, it comes out of a story where Jesus has been teaching on the nature of faith. You know, so, and it's where he's teaching his disciples on faith just in the verses prior to this. And he talks about having faith as a mustard seed. You know, they ask him to increase our faith. And Jesus, if I'm reading this right, he essentially says, it really isn't the quantity of your faith that matters. If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, it's going to transform you and the world around you. What matters is the quality of your faith. And then he tells this story, or the next story that Luke chooses to follow up that interaction between Jesus and his disciples is this story of the lepers being healed. And this story ends with Jesus commending the one leper who was not only healed, but who came back to express gratitude as having faith. And he says, your faith has saved you. Some translations say your faith has saved you. That's what this particular English. The other says has healed you. But I thought that was also interesting that Jesus, all 10, like you said, ask for his help. And then he doesn't immediately heal them. He tells them to go and show themselves to the priest. And then at some point on their journey, they realize they've been healed. They no longer have leprosy. So in a sense, Jesus says, your faith has saved you. But all 10 were healed. So what is he talking about here in terms of what has this one leper received that perhaps the other 9 did not? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or
no,
kind of throwing it, putting you on the spot.
There, yeah. So, I like that thought. It's worth meditating on.
I guess my thought on this is that, like you said, we can often ask God to change something in our lives, some sort of circumstance that we need his help with. And in this scenario, all 10 of them received that level of blessing from the Lord. But it seems to me that this 10th leper who comes back and interacts with Jesus and gives him thanks, something deeper and more significant was actually being changed, healed, that he was being saved not just from this skin disease, from this physical ailment, but he was receiving a blessing from Jesus on a spiritual level. So it's one of my thoughts on this.
I like it. And you wonder, again, I go back to my initial thought of that took effort to come back.
Right.
I think gratitude takes effort on our part, and gratitude is always a response. Mm-hmm. I mean, which is at the core of what worship really is, right? Mm-hmm. When we are asking for help, that's a response to our need, right? When we're giving thanks, that's a response to God's greatness. And one is me oriented, one is God oriented, right? And one is me centered, and one is God centered, and one of them leads to joy. I think the other one leads to a sense of obligation and entitlement. Like, God, you're supposed to help me. Where are you? Why aren't you doing these things? And it's amazing how that perspective shift of gratitude and making that effort, being God-centered as a disciple that's following Christ. Here's an interesting thought is the word for Thanksgiving in Greek is the word Eucharisto, which is where we get the word Eucharist from. Which is, for many denominations, the Lord's Supper, the cup of, so he takes the bread and he gives thanks. And in Greek, that's Eucharisto. The root word for that is charis or charis, which is the word for grace. And so the whole idea of giving thanks is wrapped around the word for grace. And even deeper than that, charis, the root word for charis is the root word for joy, char, C-H-A-R. So joy, which is wrapped in grace, which is wrapped in thanksgiving, and they're all intimately connected. And Jesus would regularly practice that. And it's just a thought of this New Testament idea that grace is feasting on Thanksgiving is feasting on the grace that God has given, and finding my joy at the center of all of that. And so, this charge to give thanks. And it's also why Paul would call the cup of, the cup of thanksgiving is the Eucharist cup, of taking that in the letter to the Corinthians. So just some thoughts there as it is intimately connected. And so why was his faith that it's made him well is that he has tasted the grace of God, and he's responded to the grace of God instead of just thinking about himself. And so salvation, the walking in the way, is our response to the grace that God has given to us. It's us coming back to him in gratitude for that already extended grace of Jesus. But
man, you're giving me some amazing insights here. So let me just repeat back to see if I understood right. So charis is the Greek word for grace. Mm-hmm. Eucharist is giving thanks for, I guess you could say, an expression of God's grace, that recognizing and then responding with thanksgiving. And it's rooted in this story. We call it the Eucharist in terms of the Lord's Supper because of Jesus breaking the bread and giving thanks. That's amazing. I mean, I never knew that.
I was going to say that later for when we talk about ways our ways to practice Thanksgiving. I think Lord's Supper is from the very beginning one of the reasons, and it's one of the arguments for why maybe we should take that every Sunday.
Right.
Is that it is built, if you're doing it as a practice of gratitude, of thanksgiving for the ultimate grace. And my whole week starts with this gratitude for grace, this gratefulness in that. Yeah.
Right. Well, final thoughts on this story from my point of view with these 10 men who were healed. He comes back and it says that he falls face down and gave thanks to Jesus. And, you have to read between the lines when you read the Bible. You sort of have to, because the next thing you read is that it says that Jesus responds by, "Were not 10 cleansed? Didn't any return to give glory to God except this foreigner?" And what I mean by reading between the lines, you have to infer, like, what was the tone of voice? How when Jesus asked this question, first of all, it's interesting that this is his first response to this man coming back and giving thanks. He immediately highlights, wait a second, did the other 9 not receive healing? I think that's rhetorical. Yes, they did. All 10 were cleansed. We see that in the story. So it isn't that Jesus wasn't aware that the other 9 had been cleansed, but he's remarking on only 1 out of 10. So a few things stand out to me on this, and then I'd love to see if you have anything to add. One is that the ratio stands out to me, 10%. 1 out of 10 blessings were acknowledged and gratitude was expressed. And it could be easy for me to sit in judgment on those 9 men who did not. My guess is that they were pumped. They were excited. It wasn't that they were bummed out by being healed. They just didn't make the loop back to Jesus to say thank you. And if I apply it to my own life, a question that I have is, could it be true that out of all that God is doing in my life, I'm only recognizing and expressing gratitude for maybe 10% of it, that there's a lot that God is doing that I should be expressing gratitude for, that I'm simply failing to. And then the other thing that stands out to me is that I believe that it mattered to Jesus, that his preference would have been for all 10 to come back and express that gratitude, and that it wasn't just because he needed it, but it was meaningful to him, and it probably would have been good for their souls. So that's how I want to, on a personal level, try to process this story. Is in my own life, am I expressing gratitude at the level that I should be?
I like that.
Any last thoughts from you on Luke 17?
I like that.
Yeah, I think this is a good. The last thing I'll say on this is, I would like to be the one that came back, not the 9 that didn't. And I think each of us has this opportunity when we begin to cultivate and practice gratitude. Is we can be this 1 versus the 9, but we could just as easily be the 9 if we don't cultivate it, because life is happening. We're excited. Well, let's transition to how. That's probably a good segue to how gratitude changes us and the world around us. And we've been working through several Psalms over the past few weeks. Psalm 145, you shared some really great insights recently on a Sunday about Psalm 145 and how it not only when we express gratitude, it not only changes us, but it enables others to enter into the goodness of God and see all that he is doing. When you think about how gratitude changes us, what are some thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, I mean, those are fresh. I'm thinking about that of when one generation will commend your works to another, they will tell of your excellent deeds, and I will meditate on your greatness. Essentially, and it is just the ripple effect of when I am grateful and I live out of that gratitude. In a sense, I'm giving testimony to this God is more than just words on a page, more just than a subject. This is the living God that moves, and I'm recognizing him. And it causes those around me to pause and think about this God that I am saying is the source of the good things in my life, right? And for them to see that, and then that's thinking of maybe those that are outside of the faith, that it's a powerful tool of evangelism, that I am pointing to the source of the good things that I've tasted. But you think even within those within the faith, it is such a powerful source of encouraging one another to cast their gaze upon the giver of good things. You think in the New Testament of saying, hey, do not be deceived, for every good gift comes from above. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to this idea that deception is to think that good things can come from somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And so to help myself and my family of believers that I'm a part of to battle deception is to look up to the Lord of lights, he'll call him in that text, right? To the Father of good things, and say, hey man, God, you give all these things. Another area that I've been thinking about in this is that I also think how it shapes us is that it reorients our anxieties. And there's a deep connection between Thanksgiving, this Philippians 4 passage, and you have, I think, Paul probably practicing what he's preaching here as he's sitting in a jail cell, writing this to the church of Philippi, and he tells them, chapter 4, to rejoice in the Lord always, in every circumstances, to rejoice. And I've always loved this word, joy, like put that record on repeat and continue to say thank you over and over again, and do this always. Let your gentleness be evident to all. So there's a connection between my peacefulness and the joy. And I know that to be true. When I'm anxious, I am not a peaceful person. I'm worked up, harshness comes out of me. So there's a connection there. And he goes on to say, for the Lord is near. So let your gentleness be evident to all. So the Lord is near. And that's always true, but I don't always see that.
Right.
But I think you go back to practicing gratitude on a regular basis, rejoicing leads to gentleness, and it helps me see the Lord is near. Right. And then he goes on, his next line says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I think oftentimes where the focus on this gets in, just pray about it and tell your God what you need. But I think thanksgiving is actually the key to this passage of what he's talking about. He's saying, no, if you do it with a thankful heart that recognizes, God, you are near me, you are the giver of good things, you come in, you transform my anxieties to peacefulness. And again, it's not that it says he's going to change the situation that you're petitioning him about, but that he changes you within that situation to be a person of gentleness and peace. And so I think there's an intimate connection between our anxieties and our peace and our gratitude, or what record we're replaying over and over in our head. Is it gratitude, or is it my anxious thoughts over and over,
Man, there is a lot to dive into there. I want to touch on, you talked about the word rejoice, and you connected it to, you sort of split it between and joy. And it actually just took me back to what you were sharing a few minutes back about the Eucharist, that there's joy. Am I remembering this right? That the grace of God brings us joy. But the way it's almost like these Russian dolls is the mental picture I have, as what you're going to see on the outside, the thing that is the starting point for us is thanksgiving, giving thanks for God's grace. And then, that brings us into this place of joy. And it's also, Paul talks about in Philippians 4 there, I've learned the secret of contentment. And you think about contentment and being discontented. being discontent is no way to live. We've all been there, and it's not a great experience. And yet Paul had learned this secret of being content in any circumstance. And it just draws my attention to, he had learned to give thanks in every circumstance. And that led him to learning how to be content. I think you're right. When I actually memorized Philippians 4, 6, and 7 years ago, and I've seen this with others that I've helped memorize that verse. There are two words that we always leave out when you're first learning that. And I saw it in my own life, and I've seen it, and it's with thanksgiving. That's the little thing that's so easy, even whether we're memorizing that or whether we're trying to practice it. He says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God.
And I think often we treat it as an add-on.
Yes.
But not, I think it's at the very core, because you bring it all the way back up to fourth with verse 4 of rejoice in everything. Like rejoice always. Right. That this is what his big point is, and it is practice thanksgiving. Yeah. And then when things happen, you're not going to be anxious, because the Lord is near, because you've been practicing Thanksgiving, and you can talk to him about, I got some stuff that I'm worked up about here, because he's near to you. Right. And this peace that surpasses understanding, that the Spirit begins to minister to you. Yeah. And you're at ease. And hey, the Lord is my shepherd. I don't want, and he makes me lie down in green pastures. And I think that's learning to practice the nearness that happens when you practice gratitude.
Well, I'm going to mix in we're going to finish with some practical ways that we can cultivate it. I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, but one acronym that I learned as just a framework for prayer as an early follower of Jesus was the word ACTS, ACTS. And I would just share it with those listening right now. And it's a pattern of entering into our time of prayer. The writer of Hebrews says that we can draw near with confidence into the throne room of God. So it's a great mental picture of what we're doing when we pray. But just as you would think entering into the presence of a great king, you would want to start with adoration. You would want to start with an acknowledgement of his greatness and his worth, his position in relation to you. And then that's the A. The C is confession. And I think confession should be on two sides. One is confessing truths that we know about God himself. So we're confessing our beliefs about him and his goodness, but also confessions about our shortcomings. And the word confess just simply means to agree with. So we're agreeing with God about what he has told us and revealed about himself, but also about our need for him. So that's the C. The T is thanksgiving. So we begin to thank him for who he is and what he's done in our lives and in the world. And then the S is supplications. We begin to make known our needs and our prayers. And if you start with that framework, it's just a great way to put things into perspective, so that you're not just starting off with supplication, which is what we want to do, because that's that's the felt need that we have that's driving us oftentimes to prayer. But that's a great little framework that folks can hang on to and maybe practice in your prayer this week, is to enter into your times of prayer with adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and then supplication. So one way that gratitude changes us is it helps us be less anxious. It helps us experience contentment. Other thoughts on how gratitude, gratitude changes us and how it changes the world around us?
I think I have several thoughts there, and just anecdotes of in my life and in the lives of folks that God has blessed me to walk alongside in hard seasons. Mm-hmm. And there is a distinct difference in those that experience the peace that surpasses understanding and those that do not. There is a common thread, and Thanksgiving is at the heart of that. Mm-hmm. And I've been in hospital rooms where terrible diagnoses have come, and yet peace was still present. And I've been there when it wasn't. The flip side of that is I don't say that to heap grief on anybody. As much as Thanksgiving is a powerful spiritual practice, so is lament. And it's also a biblical one. And maybe we should have a follow-up here of let's have honest conversation that there are seasons where I need to give thanks. And there is a tie, by the way, to lamenting and thanksgiving. You will find, everybody loves the verse, your mercies are made new every morning. Few know that comes from the book of Lamentations.
Right.
And so what is he doing there in the midst of his lamenting that the world is not as it should be? And that's okay. That's good biblical language to complain to God. Mm-hmm. And yet he couches all of that with thanksgiving for God's mercy, right? And so there's follow-up conversations. So I would say if you are not in a place of gratitude, we're not saying fake joy before the Lord.
Right.
Instead, hey, seek the Lord with your whole heart. Be honest with him. Lament.
Right.
But at the same time, then respond to what you do know, that he has given the Son of Suffering, who suffers alongside of us and with us, who is a good high priest who can relate to all of our suffering. And so even in my lamenting, I can give thanks for that. I may not be thankful for my situation. I may not be thankful for these pains that I'm experiencing, but I am thankful that Christ has already overcome the world, and he knows and can relate to my painfulness. And so I just think it's important to advocate that in your Thanksgiving, we're not saying fake it until you make it. Mm-hmm. That's not what we're saying, but we're saying it is a powerful tool to see God, particularly in those moments of heartache, is to reorient your heart back around to see the cross, which I think maybe that's where the Eucharist can be such a strong gift, right? Of hey, I'm going to take this bread and remember your body. I'm going to take the cup of thanksgiving and remember your blood, and know that you've overcome everything. So, and that reshapes my sadness, and it reshapes it doesn't necessarily take away whatever heartaches are there, but it can help me in the midst of all of that, to still have a heart of praise.
And I'll just point folks, if you're watching this video on YouTube, we'll put a card here to a conversation you and I had maybe a year and a half back on the examen and how to go through that process of being honest with God and taking full stock of the lamentations, but also the consolations, and being honest and working through that. It's a great exercise and something that we can even practice on a daily basis. And I know that's something that you've talked about practicing in the evening. So let's finish with that. Maybe some helpful ways if folks are convinced gratitude is important. I want to cultivate becoming a more grateful, thankful person. Let's talk about some practical ways to do that. We've already shared Acts as a framework for prayer. We have a link to this conversation on the examen. What other thoughts that you have, practical ways?
Well, I think it's important to note this. I don't think anybody will accidentally be grateful.
That's what I think we buy into, is that, hey, if something external changes, then I'll be grateful. So I think that's a strong statement that's actually not the way it works.
It's not. You might have a quick response of excitement for something, right, but I don't know if excitement is the same as gratefulness.
No.
Right, and gratitude. And so I think gratitude is a posture of heart. And if you look at how the Bible, how many times in Psalms it gives the charge to be grateful. It's funny that my alarm just went off, and that's my noon alarm. But here's what that is. This is one of the things that I was, it really is. That's my noon alarm for the Lord's Prayer. And that was one of the practices I was going to recommend. Is I have 3 alarms on my phone to wrap my day in a daily rhythm of waking up at a particular time to pray for my day, to give God thanks for this day, to watch the sunrise, to know that it's coming from him, and to just kind of start in that peaceful place, just me and God. The house is quiet. I can do that. I don't always succeed in that. Sometimes the alarm goes off and I reach over and hit the snooze button, but that's the idea. Noon, I thank God. I say the Lord's Prayer, but I love that you give thanks for the daily bread. This is you thank you for this and what you provide. And then at night, I practice an examine style prayer. And so I have an alarm set on my phone. And so the idea is every day I just want to wrap my day in an acknowledgement. To go back to Romans 1, I want to see God and I want to acknowledge, hey, you are God, and I want to be grateful for that and live my day out of that. And I think getting into that daily rhythm, I know of other, saints in our church who have some daily gratitude practices of getting up. One lady goes on a walk and she every day, and she has a certain set of scriptures she memorizes, and and then she keeps a prayer journal of gratitude and thanks. And I think there's meaningful ways. I think what I would argue for is, and we can offer up some other practices, but what I would argue for is find a daily rhythm for you that you can daily, and not flippantly, but purposefully and thoughtfully from your soul express gratitude for God and reflect on what he's doing in and around you. And so if that's like me, a rhythmic kind of way to do that throughout your day, or if that is every night before I go to sleep, I'm going to do this. I'm going to keep a journal. I'm going to purposely look. But I think the bigger charge is to make it an effort and a practice so that your heart's posture is one of gratitude. What about you? You have any practices that you would recommend?
Yeah, I've shared this before, but when I'm in prayer, to think through Father, family, fields, and those are just three distinct areas. It's just helpful for me to have, I guess, areas of emphasis. And so when I think about God, one thing that I can do when I'm expressing thankfulness is I can often be focused on what he's done for me, which is totally appropriate. I can sometimes struggle more with expressing thankfulness to God just for who he is, his worth, and there's so much to be thankful for just in keeping with God himself and his character, his goodness. And so to start with God and to remind myself and then to express that back to him, I'm grateful that you are this quality. And then, so that's Father, and then family has to do with my physical and my spiritual family, the people that he has brought into my life that I want to express gratitude for, which I can often, I can just take that for granted. I'm grateful for the children that God has blessed me with, and the grandchildren, the friends that he's given me, the church that he's allowed me to be a part of. And I want to take the time to express that. And then fields has to do with more of the external circumstances, the work that he's entrusted to me, and the way that I see him using me, and the opportunities that I see him giving me, whether that's spiritual work or earthly work. It's a blessing to be a part of what God is doing and to have the abilities that he's given me. I mean, some of my most joyful, I would say, from the heart moments of thankfulness have been on runs where I'm outside. And it can be very simple, just the freedom to be in a beautiful place and to have a body that's functioning. These are things that I often will just take for granted. And so, Father, family, fields is just a simple way of thinking through and then expressing my gratitude to him. One of the resources that I want to make available, this is something we've been using with our church here in Chula Vista, but we put together a gratitude pathway guide, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes here. It's built around 4 Psalms from the book of Psalms that folks can work through and just develop lessons and principles and practices of gratitude as they go through those. So I hope folks take advantage of that.
Yeah, and the Psalms are so full of the word thanksgiving, of giving thanks, of gratitude. I was sitting there looking at Psalm 100 as you were talking, and just it's a short one of shout for joy to the Lord. That's where we get that. But enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise, and give thanks to him and praise his name, for the Lord is good. I always like that. For the Lord is good. Like, my heart will sometimes question that, right? So if I will practice gratitude, I'll remember he's good and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. Yeah. So the Psalms are rich. They're so good. And sometimes when we don't know, what am I supposed to pray today? The Psalms, you can pray the Psalms, to sit down and read through this. This is this ancient book. And it's something worth keeping in front of us. Yeah, it's a good tool. I'm glad you'll share that out. It's good.
Well, we are in the season of Thanksgiving, so I hope that folks are blessed by that, but I also hope that each of us can come out of this holiday of Thanksgiving becoming more thankful, grateful people. And I really appreciate you coming on, Shelton, sharing with us. A lot is at stake, both for us and for the world that we're part of. So let's take it serious and let's cultivate that.
Yeah, and enjoy your Thanksgiving feasts. I think that's a cool. I think Jesus feasted, and it's worth having rhythmic feasts in our year to give thanks. And so don't feel guilty about that huge plate of food.
That's right.
But thank the Lord for it, and it's a way of saying, hey, he opens his hands and he satisfies the desires of every living creature. And in a couple of Thursdays from now, my desire will be mashed potatoes and apple pie and all the things, and I'll be grateful. But remember, that comes from the Lord's hand. Hey, prayerful that this helps others to be thoughtful practitioners of gratitude to Christ and all that he does. Thanks for letting me come on.